Very pleased today to introduce Anya Prince, who is professor and the Joseph F. Rosenfield Fellow in Law at the University of Iowa College of Law. So especially excited to have a fellow Hawkeye here. Her teaching and research interests explore health and genetic privacy with particular focus on genetic discrimination, the health privacy implications of big data, and the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic testing. Her research particularly explores the intersections of social and biological data by interrogating the ethical and legal implications of how genetic data be used to predict social traits and behaviors, and conversely, how social data can be used to predict medical information, including reproductive information. So please join me in welcoming Professor Prince.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here and to get to chat. So I'm going to talk today about an NIH-funded grant that we have looking at the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic testing for social traits. A lot of this, oops. While I figure out, there we go. A lot of this is unpublished data, and so yeah, please don't share. Okay, so there's a new type of genetic test that's coming about called polygenic scores. So a lot of our traditional genetic testing is monogenic, which is we can look for one gene and that's connected to one or a small set of diseases. So BRCA gives you an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Huntington's disease is one gene that that basically not just increases your risk, but you're likely to get Huntington's disease unless something else kills you before then, right? But most diseases, diabetes, heart disease, lots of cancers, have multiple causes. There's not just one disease or one gene that causes this disease. And so we have these polygenic scores. So what polygenic scores do is they take genome-wide association studies that have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people's data in them, biobanks. They take this genetic data from biobanks, and they look through the entire, all of the sort of exome parts of the genome, and then they find associations with an outcome of interest. So they can basically compare hundreds of thousands of people's genetic DNA and say which genetic variants come up most often for people who have heart disease, a specific type of heart disease, and then they create a score. And it creates this percentile. So similar to when we used to get percentile scores for math and reading in elementary school, that's what you can get from a polygenic score. So somebody might be in the 95th percentile for breast cancer, and so that in some circumstances can confer as much risk as a monogenic genetic test. So these can be very powerful and helpful in the medical sphere, and there's a lot of research going on. But when we're looking at this, we're just looking at correlation. We're not understanding the biological mechanisms that cause these diseases. We're just seeing which variants pop up most often with somebody with an outcome. And so that means we can pick any outcome we want and match people who have that thing of interest with people who don't. And so what's starting to happen is there's starting to be polygenic scores for social traits, things like risk tolerance. So all sorts of social science surveys that people fill out when they participate in biobanks are being used. Educational attainment, risk tolerance, same-sex sexual behaviors. So I'll talk about many of these, but this is the idea is how do you think about genetic testing for these more social and behavioral traits as opposed to the more medical? And I'll just say at the outset, this is not a clean-cut dichotomy. A lot of what we are thinking about in this project is how do you even define social and medical? But people, and I'll show this data, have different opinions about the extremes. And so what does that mean for sort of all of it overall? Okay, so what are some of the potential benefits? And I'll just say in terms of language, there's a lot of different terms. You might have heard polygenic risk scores. Those are most often used for the medical. You have a risk for colon cancer, you have a risk for heart disease. the sociogenomics space doesn't like the polygenic risk score because it doesn't make sense to say, I have a risk for higher income. Like that doesn't really make sense, right? So then they started using polygenic scores. So that's the terminology I use for this space is PGS. There's a bigger push to now call them polygenic indices because scores seems too individualized and they're not supposed to be used for individual purposes, and indices seems better. So you might see PGI as well in this space if you're interested in it. Okay, so what are the potential benefits? The number one benefit that people talk about in this space is the benefit to social science and or genetic research. So essentially, if you're doing social science research, you could control for genetics. So let's say we're doing a social science research and we want to see whether Head Start improves certain students' scores in elementary school. Well, let's control for the genetic confounders that might get in the way of telling us whether or not the Head Start program works. So that's one potential benefit. Or vice versa, we can understand genetics better if we can understand gene-environment interactions. And so these help us possibly to understand some of the complexities of gene and environment. And so one thing you might hear sociogenomic researchers say a lot is it's not the nurture versus nature, but this is trying to be nurture and nature together and really help to understand some of those complexities. Another potential benefit in the way that people talk about it is to actually use these for some sort of version of precision medicine. So perhaps precision education is the one that's talked about the most. So if we have a score for educational attainment that we can determine from somebody's genes, and we could identify that very early on, then perhaps we could identify students who maybe have dyslexia or have some sort of other learning disability or something genetic or some biological thing that might impair their learning. And if we could give more resources early on, then we can improve everybody, right? And so, so this idea is maybe there's types of interventions that we could do based on these scores. Now that's a more controversial version of the benefits. The research parts of the benefits are more squarely across the field. Well, what are some of the limitations or critiques? So I mentioned a few already. These are not causative. We are not finding what causes somebody to have higher educational attainment. We're not identifying what causes somebody to have higher income. We're identifying genetic correlates. And so that's a limitation, right? We don't actually know whether which part of, whether we're even identifying a genetic cause. We might be identifying an environmental cause that is also associated with families. These scores are predominantly created using people of European ancestry, data from people with European ancestry. And in fact, even in biobanks that have more diverse populations, many of these don't analyze people of non-European ancestry. In the medical space, polygenic risk scores are doing more to get more diversity, to have cross or trans ancestry scores, but I haven't seen that so much in this more social space. They also are not predictive at all, right? So educational attainment is the highest one we have, and that's between like 16%, like 12 and 16%, I think was the latest educational attainment GWAS that was done. So it predicts between 12 to 16% of the variation, but many of the other ones I'm going to talk about predict 3%, 1%. 0.2%, right? These are not predicting a lot. And so maybe they're still helpful for research, but what does that mean when we use them across the scores? And there's lots of other potential critiques that we can raise. But all of this then brings up these harms, right? What does it mean for equity if we have precision education from scores that are predominantly from people of European ancestry? And they might, oh, and I should say, one of the limitations is they're created using individuals of European ancestry, and there's studies that show that those scores don't port well to other ancestries. So not only is it only using this, it's saying if you use this to try to predict in a non-European ancestry population, it's not going to do as well. And it's not just ancestry, it's income, right? They've shown that it doesn't predict across incomes. It doesn't predict across genders. It doesn't predict across geographic locations. So what does that really mean if we start to implement this out in the world and we're using this narrower data set to predict other things? This is also sitting atop a really dark history of misuse of behavioral genetics for racist ideologies. And so we've seen one of the most prominent examples to date is when there was tragically the shooter that went into a Buffalo supermarket in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. In his writings, he quoted some of the sociogenomic literature to that he thought, right, supported his awful views. Okay, and so that's an extreme version, but one of the things that I'm really interested in is the more subtle but no less pernicious use of this, right? So if we use this in society to have better education models, right, and this imbues more disparities into our society, what does that then, you know, what does that look like? So lots of potential harms that we can start to see. Okay, so I mentioned that this is a larger grant. I'm a co-PI with Jean Cadigan at UNC, and we did 3 things. I'm going to talk about all 3 of these aims, but essentially we wanted to see what the literature said about this. And then we were really interested in stakeholder perspective. So I'll show a little bit of our data from biobank participant surveys and focus groups. We just finished all of our data collection like this last week, so hurrah! But we finished our interviews. So we interviewed PRS, the medical researchers doing this. We interviewed the more PGS, more sociogenomic researchers, and interviewed social scientists who are purportedly the end user of this to see what they thought. And then we're now squarely looking at sort of what does the law and governance say about this. So horizon scanning. This is a methodology that is sort of a glorified systematic review, but it was recommended by NIH's Next Track to be forward-looking, to be able to identify emerging issues in technology. And so I'm just going to talk about our literature search for this. We also looked at conference abstracts and preprints and things to sort of be more forward-looking. But we reviewed over 1,000 articles. We had a really broad search terms, and we identified 441 articles that we labeled as PGS for social traits. Again, you could quibble with where we put the defining line. I'm happy to talk about that more. One of the big things that we did is we did not include genetic testing or scores for psychiatric illnesses, or so things like ADHD, bipolar, depression. There's a lot of literature. In fact, I would say a lot of what we excluded is in that camp. But basically we said if it has a DSM category, so that's the disease diagnostic category, we excluded it. But behaviors that are closely associated with some of those, like aggression, we would include. And so then we coded them in lots of different ways, but one thing we coded for was methods. And I'm going to talk about 2 of our method codes, which are development and utilization. So what do I mean by that? We label things as score development if it was the article that created the score in the first place. So here is the one on risk tolerance that I mentioned. So it was a genome-wide association study of over 1 million people. And they were comparing answers to questions like, how risky are you, right? Or speeding, do you speed when you drive? How much do you drink? And how many sexual partners have you had, right? And that, combining all of those things, is the thing that says this is how risky you are, right? So you can already start to maybe think about some of the problems of having that be the definition of risk in our society. Okay, and then utilization are the types of papers that take that score and test them out in another population. And so this one looked at people who skydived, when skydiving, how do you make that past tense? People who like to skydive, they tested out whether or not they had the higher polygenic score for risk tolerance. If we use that as the barometer, I am at the low end of risk tolerance because you will never find me skydiving. Okay. So I'm just going to be talking about those score development utilization studies from here on out. So we identified over 59, or I guess 59, around 60 traits. So this is just an example of some of the traits that we identified. Same-sex sexual behavior is one of the most controversial ones that has been in the news a lot, but intelligence IQ, extroversion, criminality, voter behaviors. Obesity is one that we included as social, but probably one that people push back the most. So I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. Okay, so if we look at how often, so we have 287 total articles that were in that score development utilization. The vast majority are in educational attainment, and then you can start to see some of them, but we get pretty quickly into ones that are more squarely, I think, in our space, like subjective well-being, intelligence IQ. You can see the smoking behaviors, alcohol problems. We excluded the ones that were alcohol use disorder, right, has a DSM category, but included the ones that were just about the behavior of drinking. So again, fuzzy line here. Okay, then we coded how these articles talk about limitations, or how often they talk about limitations. And so these were some of the limitations that were most commonly mentioned. Portability, as I mentioned, confounders, how the trait is measured, so what question was asked, what data limitations, and then portability across other factors. Those were our most common limitations that we saw. In terms of benefits, they were sort of diffuse in what was talked about. I should say I'm not showing the data on this, but we also coded uses. And so use for prevention would be coded as a use as opposed to a benefit necessarily. So there is some overlap there. But generally it was help us to understand, right? This might be good for research. The benefit is just knowledge creation. And you get a couple that start to talk about, well, maybe we could use this to help with inequities or to decrease social injustices. But a lot of it's just, this is good for us to know. For harms, we coded that. And so some of the harms that you see are social injustices that might stem from this. Genetic determinism was a big one, a little bit of eugenics and misinterpretation. But here's the end, right? I've been showing all the graphs in a similar size, so I don't know if you were looking at the end, but in terms of the number of articles that we saw that brought these up, most had a limitation section. Not surprising because, or most had limitations, right? Not surprising because when you write in a medical or in a peer-reviewed literature, the peer reviewer is going to say, where's your limitations section or where's your limitations paragraph? So it's not surprising to me. In fact, it's surprising to me that it's not higher than 85%. But about 50% talked about benefits in some way, but less than 10% even began to talk about what some of the harms could be. One of the other things we did was to do the same search, but across lay literature. And so things like Google or Bloomberg News, and we identified 123 included articles in this study. And we coded them in very similar ways. And so here you can see the academic literature is what I have been talking about. The lay literature are the more newspaper articles, press releases, things like that. And so you can see there, they about half talk about harms. And so that's the line that I really think is interesting is that, well, the limitations and the harms, they both talk about benefits about 50% of the time, but the academic is way more likely to talk about the limitations, and the lay literature is way more likely to talk about harms. So why the difference? Well, as I mentioned, right, the motivations might be different. That you need to write about a limitations section. The harms are a little bit like sexier for a newspaper article. Maybe it's not, the scientists who are writing these articles don't feel like that's the space to talk about the harms. right? The scientific articles are supposed to be empirical driven and more neutral, and going into the harms is a little bit more speculative. And so maybe they don't feel comfortable. It's not their role to think about the harms. And in fact, there's some discussion in the literature about that. They also have a different focus. So eugenics or scientific racism was the most commonly cited harm in the lay literature, but only mentioned, I think, 4 times in the 287 academic articles. So you can just see, and these are the ends. I'm comparing ends right here, even though the denominator is way different, right? So if we did percentages, we'd have an even starker contrast in terms of how often these articles brought everything up. All right. So, you know, one of the things we're thinking about is, how do you govern this? What are the concerns and how do you govern this? Well, we could have a lot of governance structures that could help to make these conversations more equal, right? Where the scientific literature is bringing up potential harms more often. If you write in your grant application right now, here, we're going to do this cool thing where we identify genetic correlates to educational attainment, and we're scared that this is going to create wide disparities in the country, right? Nobody's going to fund that grant project. If you publish that, people might not, editors might not accept it, right? So are there ways where we can actually have some of these softer governance structures encourage these types of dialogues in a way that won't minimize funding and the like? And then I think there's an open question, and I'm happy to discuss this with people and hear your thoughts in the Q&A. Should there be, right? Is the scientific literature the place to have these articles or these discussions, or is it somewhere else? And I should note, we also coded for ELSI discussions, and that I'm not talking about that literature, right? So there might be some of these discussions. There are some of these discussions going on outside the score development and utilization, but we narrowed into that because we want to see, when the science is actually created, how are they talking about the science? Okay. So I'm going to turn now and talk about some of our empirical data that's coming out. So we're really interested in biobanks and biobank participants, and why? Because that's the data that much of this research is coming from. They're using de-identified samples from these large scale, right? How else do you get 1 million people for a risk tolerance study, right? And so the UK Biobank is by far, so this is still our horizon scanning, but the UK Biobank was the most cited biobank that was used. The rest are all US based, except Netherlands down at the bottom, and the COGA, I think, is international. I don't know, the collaborative study on the genetics of alcoholism, I think, is international, but a lot of US based and very much European, right? European US based. Okay. So one of the things that helps all of this is broad consent. Jeff, as a fellow Los Angelean, you might get this, but this is the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, which is spelled broad. So, you know, okay. So this gives us general consent for future research. And here's the UK Biobank's broad consent language, a shortened version of it. But I give permission for long-term storage and use of my blood and urine samples for health-related research purposes, even after my incapacity or death. And I relinquish all these rights to samples which I am donating to the UK Biobank. What words do I focus in on there? Health-related, right? If you are a biobank participant and you say, yes, I want health-related research, and then you find out that your sample was used in a GWAS study for same-sex sexual behavior, do you think that's within the bounds of your consent? I don't know. I think it's starting to push against it a little bit, especially when we start to think about how people think about this. So we did a survey of Mayo Clinic Biobank participants and focus groups of a segment of those, and I'll show some of that data. Mayo Biobank participants, perhaps not surprisingly, because of being predominantly in Minnesota, skew white, and we had about more participation from women in that survey, and skew highly educated. But for that reason, we wanted to make sure to get diverse perspectives. So we also did a general population survey to try to get make sure we had more diversity. So we oversampled here across race and ethnicities to get more. And I'll show you both of those data points. And here also you can see the education has more with less than a bachelor's degree. Okay, so we asked, I'll just show a couple of questions here. So we asked them, I trust scientists to think about the social implications of their research. So you can see the biobank participants in blue are the Mayo Clinic. And so a little bit more trust, but not necessarily wildly different. And I trust scientists to think about the risks or harms of their research. So really interesting when I just showed you a lot of data that they're at least not publicizing about what those risks and benefits are. Doesn't mean they're not thinking about it, but interesting to put those together. Okay, and then we also asked them, I support research on polygenic scores for medical traits versus social traits. Right? And here I think is the big difference that I find so fascinating. So even though we know this is a continuum and that it's not a clear dichotomy, when presenting this to biobank participants, there's quite a large skewing between being comfortable with research that's more social versus research that's more medical. And then we asked them not just, are you comfortable with this research, but I'm comfortable with my information being used to develop these scores. And again, we see a lot more support for their own research being used for biobanks versus not. And we also see a little bit more trust coming out of Mayo Biobank again, right? And we saw this in our focus group themes. So when we did our focus groups to get a little bit more information, we generally saw these same themes, that they were more supportive for use of their data to develop medical traits than social traits. And participants trust the biobanks, and so they're more likely to approve of that research. But they're concerned about what happens when these scores go out into society. So I'll show a few quotes from that. So for me, I would have no problem whatsoever if the genetic information from which I donated was used in medical research, if it could help someone. As far as the social traits, you know, I'm on the fence. I can see tremendous benefit and I can see tremendous negatives from that. In terms of trust in the biobanks, I mean, this is positive research. I trust the clinic. I trust what the data is going to be used for. Scientific research here. It isn't something, I don't believe you guys have negative intent here. You're not going to go and weaponize it. This will be used, I think, to expand our knowledge and the future of our children and our society and our culture. And I should say one of our team members is also from the Mayo Clinic, and so that's why I think they were using the "our" language here, or you guys. In terms of use of the data, for research purposes, I guess I still hold true to when I first initially consented that this is what I signed up for. So I'm okay with it because of that. The institution that I volunteered for in providing my genetic data or genetic material data for future uses, I trusted as good stewards. And the participant 5 in this same focus group said, I'm a pretty open book. I would have no issue with it. If the scientific community would find value in it, I've got no problem. But then we start to see some of those concerns about use of data. So we obviously all care enough about research that, you know, we participated in the biobank to begin with, and we followed up and answered the survey. And then we said, yeah, we would do this. You know, even science has a way of sometimes going off the rails. You know, Oppenheimer was a big movie over the summer. We all, you know, everybody heard about it. Everybody knew he did the thing back in, you know, during World War II. So if it's just for the sake of research, gaining knowledge and gaining insight into the human condition, but when you let sciences use some stuff. And similarly, we see one here that said, I don't have any problems with my genetics being used for research at all in any category. I do have some reservations of what's done with that, how it's used, and who's using it for what purposes. I tiptoed around it, but Hitler, for crying out loud, if he had this kind of knowledge, and he was doing it, but without this kind of knowledge. And so if it gets in the wrong hands for the wrong reason, then you're creating a super race, or you're trying to do whatever. And whether it's intelligence or strength, I'm against that. I'm for having it used to help mankind. And then the last one from the focus groups. I don't have any problem with my genetics being used for research at all in any category. I do have some reservation with what's done with that and how it's used. Oh, that's the same one. I'm sorry. Okay, that was the last one. So you can start to see some of these same themes bubbling up from the biobank participants, including how I started with the potential benefits, right? It can really help research, but then what do you do when it starts to get out into society? And so that's where we're at now with this project, is starting to look at some of the societal implications. And so Shaniqua Collier and I are in charge of this aim, and we're both lawyers on the project looking at how this is governed, right? What if this data gets out? And so we've been thinking about some of the places where it can be used and where it is used most often. So we have research, right? And we could talk about, I won't go into sort of the legal structures around all of these, but this is what we're looking at, so I'm happy to answer questions about it. It's been discussed a lot in reproduction, in IVF settings. And if you're joining the discussion after this, I pulled out some articles specifically about use of these social traits in IVF context. I've mentioned education. We have criminal law where it can be used, employment or insurance, right? Would an insurance company, like a life insurance company, care whether you're at a heightened risk or you have a higher risk tolerance or not? And commercial space, right? And so there's lots of different legal frameworks that map onto all of these potential uses out in society. And I would just say the short end of it is that these legal frameworks are not really ready for this space. So let me give you one quick example to end with, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. But there are some state anti-discrimination laws that say genetic information and genetic test results can't be used to discriminate in insurance or employment. Well, how do they define genetic test? Well, they define genetic test or genetic information as variants associated with an increased risk of disease or a condition. Okay, so is genetic tests of a genetic test that shows that you have a higher likelihood to have same-sex sexual behaviors, does that meet the state definition? Probably not, because it would be hard-pressed to define same-sex sexual behaviors as a disease or condition, right? We've done that in the past. That was problematic. Thankfully, we've moved away from that, right? And so then would that state law not apply to an employer using that genetic test because it doesn't fall under that definition? And so the law just, even in those subtle ways of just defining genetic tests as this, oh, we just think of genetics and therefore it's medical, doesn't take into account that we can now start to predict these broader array of items from somebody's genome. And I don't think the law is ready for it as yet. So the next phase of our project is doing some case studies on that and thinking about ways to fill in some of those gaps in governance. With that, I will thank our team. We have a large team, a lot from UNC, people from Iowa, George Washington, Mayo Clinic. And I think I'm getting everybody from there. And then, of course, thanks to NIH for sponsoring us and to the Mayo Biobank for everything. So I'm happy to open up the discussion and dialogue.
Thank you so much, Anya. Any takers for the first question?
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. So it seems like with the stakeholders you talked to, there were views about the kind of stewardship that was ongoing with wherever they banked it. Are you digging into how they're actually stewarding these things? I'm sure it's highly variable because you've got 23andMe on there, but.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I think in terms of, so a couple of things I'll say. the biobank participants that we took from were Mayo biobank participants. And we've seen this because, Karen Mahar is at Mayo Clinic and helps to run their community advisory boards. And so what I understand from her is that there's like a rich ethos among the biobank participants in Mayo, right? I think they're maybe uniquely supportive and trustworthy and engaged with Mayo as this institution. So we're not surprised necessarily to see those themes arising from the biobank that we worked with. We were trying to work with a couple of other biobanks, particularly focusing on diverse communities, and unfortunately those relationships fell through for all sorts of various reasons. So that's why we see trust there. We aren't specifically looking at the governance structures of other ones. I think that would be an area ripe for further investigation. I mean, you mentioned 23andMe. One thing I want to do in the governance is just look up their broad consent language of all of them. Our top ones. So we looked up UK Biobank. I haven't looked up the others yet, but I'm going to guess they say similar things. And I hope to write to that community, at least of their data governance, right? People are saying who can have access to this. And so I think even just providing some information to help that governance, but I'd be happy to talk about, I'll find ways. I mean, I think it's sort of hard to say, hey, can you tell us all about your governance structures so that we can critique them on how you're doing? I mean, those are difficult things to study that aren't necessarily out in the world, but I think it's a rich topic. Yeah.
Thanks so much. It's really fascinating, especially to think about the harms and the downstream usage. And you finish with all these various legal frameworks. I'm curious, just stepping back, we use characteristics not from collecting genetic data, but we use gross characteristics in an actuarial sense already, like higher driving premiums for insurance if you get old, or based on gender. So we have those frameworks, and the question I have is, what new frameworks do we use, or how do these frameworks help or not help in resolving the downstream uses, and where would lines to be drawn to say what's legitimate and what isn't?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think the insurance one is such an interesting example. Let me go back to this. So one of the things that's discussed a lot in this space is how these scores are not supposed to be used at the individual level, right? They are, on average, somebody with a high polygenic score for educational attainment. There was let me see, I might be a little bit off on the numbers, but people with high educational attainment scores, 70% of them had graduate degrees or something like that, or higher education. And on the lower end, it was something like 13% had higher scores or had higher education in actuality, right? So lower score, higher actual education. Well, 13%, that means 13% of people who were predicted to have the low score or low education didn't. And on the other end, that means 30% of people who were predicted to have high education didn't. And so that's what it means on average this works, but for any individual, you might be in that mix. And so there's a lot of discussion on the research side of that's why it's helpful for research, because we can use it in averages, and that's why it should not be used out in society, because that's individual. But like, you can say that all you want, and yet it always gets brought back to, well, this would be great in IVF and this would be that. So the reason why I find insurance so fascinating is insurance actuarial does not care for individual prediction at all, right? They are averages. So maybe, and commercial marketing, they don't care about individual. They care on average. If we market this skydiving to people with a higher risk tolerance, on average, will we make more money from them? Criminal law, we hope we should care about the individual level. Education, we should want to care about the individual level. Reproduction, we should want to care about the individual. So there may be some ways that different segments of the law make this harder to implement or easier to implement based on even just that one fact that it's generalizable or not. But in terms of ways that it doesn't help, I think insurance is the one where they don't, you could say all you want, no, this isn't a perfect prediction. And they say, as long as it helps actuarially, let's throw it into our system.
So first of all, I just want to emphasize what you just said. I think that's absolutely right, but it's not just whether it will work in certain sectors versus others. It's whether it is appropriate in certain sectors rather than others, right? So which is related to the question I wanted to ask, which was about the educational attainment, because as you noted, like this is the one everyone talks about. This is the one with all of the literature. What you didn't say, but I'm curious about this is where the question is, like what the limitations sections and the harms pieces within the gray literature actually say, because we know that like polygenic score for education, the single best predictor is the zip code you grew up in, right? It has nothing to do with genetics. It's where you grew up and how much money your family has, right? But it's still being implemented by some school districts. So how did that literature characterize what they were trying to do with this and what the limitations and harms were?
Yeah, so for educational attainment, one of the reasons why it is studied so much are utilization studies, because it is such a high predictor. And now I haven't gone through and read every single one with like a narrow green thing, but I would say they didn't engage in that because they're just oftentimes using it as some sort of control in their own study, right? And so it's just being sort of moved on and implemented in their own study. And this is one of the critiques I have about limitation sections, right? So, I probably could have thought about this just from like an ethics perspective in general, but when you think about when we're starting to look at the score development papers and then the utilization papers, well, the score development papers say, here are the limitations, right? Only European ancestry, here's this, here's that. And then the utilization papers just say, well, here's all these limitations, and we're going to put this in our own limitations section, and done. I haven't solved the problem, but I've solved the problem for my purposes, which I've been transparent, right? And so you see how all of this just gets propagated without any actual digging into, well, what's the harm from that limitation, and how am I perpetuating that harm by now utilizing this thing that had that limitation further? And that's what I think was missing. Now, in one of the things we didn't include in this are like books. There's a ton of books and discussion about educational attainment more broadly. And there, I think there is more grappling with what are the harms, what are the limitations, and particularly, I'm sure, as you know, there's one researcher, Catherine Page Hardin, who really says these scores could be good in the educational setting to help with disparities. So she's coming at it from an equity perspective, but argues that these won't increase disparities. There are others that argue this is just like a good thing to use without, I think, engaging as much. And then there's plenty who say, no, you're all wrong. This is a horrible idea. So I think in educational attainment, there's more of that dialogue about what the harms are that can stem from them. Newfield Bioethics just has put out 2 studies in the last 3 months about the use of these scores in education and really engaging with it. And so I do think there's more discussion of those harms. But again, that's why I think it's so fascinating to focus on where the science is coming from to begin with, and how that it's outside of the scope of the science. And so what does that mean for somebody who really wants to dig in and learn the science, right? And maybe you might say that's silly. It's fine that all of this discussion is going on outside. That's where it should happen. And the GWAS studies that have come out on educational attainment, it's fine if they don't engage that. But I'll say one more thing on that. there's been an increasing movement to have these frequently asked questions pages attached to some of these studies. And so that the educational attainment ones do have. And so it says things like, can these be used for individual prediction? It's like, no, these are generalizable. And but having read those, they basically copy and paste from like study to study and then change some of the words. So it's just interesting. And there's actually sections in some of those that say like, what harms could come from this? And it's like, well, that's not our job, sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but that's actually some of the scientists in writing these frequently asked questions are like, yeah, there could be some discrimination that happens from this, but our job is to have good science and to present this well. And in fact, we should do it because if we don't do it, somebody else will do it worse. So that's some of the engagement that I've seen, but it's not easy to get to those frequently asked questions if you're looking at the article itself.
Or questions that I
Well, I will take moderator's prerogative then. So I have a question, and I don't mean this to be as aggressive as it might come out. So I don't mean this to you, but to the field. So if I am hearing that the predictive value for a lot of these is fairly poor, and there are a lot of harms, and I'm coming up against the backdrop of research resources are scarce and likely to become scarcer, why are we doing this in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a totally fair question. I think some of it are incentives. So I was just reading through the memos from our polygenic research interviews, and I didn't do any of those interviews because I'm lawyerly trained and not qualitative researcher really trained. So that was better. But they're fascinating, and multiple people brought up, like we had some postdocs and PhD researchers that we were interviewing, as well as senior scientists. And multiple of the interviewees talked about incentives, that these are relatively cheap to do now. They're sort of sexy, right? You can talk about them in evocative ways on a grant application. These scores now, they're creating these libraries where they're just on the shelf. So what do you mean by that? Well, you can just take, as long as you have some of the genetic data, you can just take the like score and implement it. You don't, I'm not a geneticist, I'm not a biostatistician, but I think the point is you don't actually need a biostatistician even on the project. They're sort of already developed, and you don't have to do a lot of the addressing of the limitations, but that's a problem because then those limitations are even further baked in. You're not controlling for some of the confounders that could happen. So I think that's some of the reason is that they're actually making this easier and easier to do. And when you can say something like, I'm going to do this cool project and I have 1 million genomes and I can, explore this topic, I think it is a flashy headline for journals and grantsmanship without, and it's faster than figuring out how income impacts education. I mean, I guess we can probably figure that out pretty easily, but you know what I mean? Like it's faster than some of the sort of more methodologically rich and more difficult questions of environment.
Thank you. Great answer. I think my question still then stands, but I understand the incentive structures at play.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think in the interview, part of what's interesting is some of the people doing this research in the interviews were like, I don't like the trainees are like, oh, but I got this postdoc and now now this is the field I'm in and now I'm gonna, right? I mean, yeah, I think the question still stands as is, like, should this be what we're doing?
Well, I feel sick. Any other questions?
Since we're moving to a round 2 of questions here. Some of what seem to be the key concepts doing ethical and legal work here, like medical versus social or health and disease, are notoriously hard to define in a way that's crisp and provides you a sort of boundary that would allow you to do the ethics and legal work. So how does that, how can you reconcile that with doing something useful in this space if you have to figure out what's a disease or what's social?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it, I'll answer in a couple different ways. One, we just submitted a supplement to our grant to look at this mind-body divide and medical versus social divide, because it's such a thorny issue. And so, so I think more to come on that topic. But I think one of the things, so I'll take obesity, right? Because I think that's the one that we thought a lot about whether to include. Obesity in the vast majority of the score development, if not all of the score development papers that we identified, is defined as BMI. And so in a lot of our discussions with people in the field, they all say, no, obesity is not. We specifically surveyed people and talked to our focus group participants about 5 traits: aggression, religious behaviors, obesity, educational attainment, and subjective well-being or life satisfaction. And when we talked to focus group participants about obesity, they were like, no, this is a bunch of garbage. BMI doesn't tell you anything. We should not be using this as a score. Like, we should not be using this in medicine. We should not be using this here. And so to see those 2 perspectives makes me more comfortable saying, well, for some people, this is social. And so, or at least the public, right? The public, as we saw, really thinks of it more as a social thing, right? The BMI, it doesn't tell you really anything about your health. It just tells you, right? And they give the examples of you know, the football player, or the, you know, whatever it is. So I don't know if that like answers anything, but I think, so, oh, the other thing I was going to say, the field, there are people who identify as sociogenomic researchers. There are some people that we defined as sociogenomic researchers because they worked on one of those 5 traits, and they were like, oh, I don't do that, right? And so it's also, I think it's the field, right? The fact that they want to be called PGI, they don't want to be PRS, right? There's some parts of the field that are sort of self-defining themselves as not medical. So therefore, I think even to just look at the field, you need to have some engagement with the divide. And then to ask people about it, right? I mean, maybe we could have done more asking biobank participants about like, and there have been some studies that instead of calling it social or medical, they just give traits, and it sort of creates this scale down where so the study that we'll look at this afternoon, thinking about this use of scores in IVF, using a score for medical conditions came up as much more popular, seen as okay more often than like skin color, right? Which isn't exactly social, but gets more on like non-medical side. So anyway, I don't know. Those are musings that I have, but it's such a difficult line. And I think too, then getting one of our trainees who's a PhD at Iowa is really interested in use in the psychiatric illnesses. And that then gets into a lot. I mean, he's looking specifically some of the neurodiversity traits, and that gets so much into a combination of identity and social and medical that it's just fascinating. And for him to deal with in his dissertation.
All right, well, thank you so much, Anya, for a wonderful presentation. Please join me in thanking Professor Prince. I have so many more. Just for the legal, well, I guess for the legal environment, I was gonna ask, like, do we know enough now to like be drafting model laws, or do we not even know how to like frame up what the harms are likely to be, and or if you pass a law, then no one will want to do anything for 20 years?
So I think that it's a little well, I think part of this, the medical social divide is a challenge. Wait, so I'm thinking like the IVF context, that's hard because I think there are a lot of reasons why somebody might want to use these for medical reason, but then like intelligence, right? But criminal? Like, should we be able to use any genetic information to say, oh, I was predisposed to aggression either? I mean, because people have used this in both prosecution and defense.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the social traits,
Yeah.
but, right, so I think some of it is grappling with, right, it's the same as medical traits, it's that the law's behind on the medical traits as well. So what I would worry is like focusing just on the social.
Yeah.
I mean, even though that's what I'm doing, right? Like, if you pass a model law just for that, then are you not addressing
Inadvertently
like,
carving out things that you think, yeah.
yeah. But, I mean, education, like, why would you use any genetics? But then I'm sure you could have a conversation with,
Yeah.
somebody trying to get a, you know, IDEA plan,
yeah.
who wants to use it. So,
That's awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
I
no,
will
of
see you
course.
tonight.
sounds good.
And also it's lovely, like, need to think bringing in law professors, I feel like in general, more engaging presentations, but maybe that's. Well, I'm just thinking like, I mean, not fair, but I'm like thinking if we were lawyers, I think there's also just like a level of like. Yeah. Probably faster. I'm overly projecting, you know, friends. Yeah, and I will steal you for, you know, caffeination whenever you're done with this.
Yeah, sounds good.
Question.
Yeah.
So with your second slide about like the unpublished data,
Mhm.
we recorded it,
Oh.
we don't have to publish it though.
No, yeah, that was just like there from a previous presentation. That's okay.
Okay, so I'm just-
No, that's fine. Because it's not like going, it's more just like not blasting it on various.
It'll be like reviews on YouTube probably.
I mean, also like, part of me is like, it doesn't really. Oh, I guess are we still recording?
Oh, yeah, that's not good. We're good. I can do all of that.
Do you want me to, here, I'll let you.